Hello, my name is Igor Marjanović, and together with Jen Howard, I'm one of the curators of the exhibition Drawing Ambience, Alvin Boyarsky and the Architectural Association. And tonight I'm connecting with you from the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum at Washington University in St. Louis, which is one of the co-organizers together with the RISD Museum of Art of this exhibition. I will tell you a little bit more about our curatorial approach to organizing the material in the exhibition and how that particular approach relates to the background of the collector, Alvin Boyarsky himself. The title itself, Drawing Ambience, relates to two particular aspects of drawings as works of art. One is that each drawing imbues a particular ambience or atmosphere in its own sheet of paper, but at the same time, when exhibited, when put on display, the drawings create a particular ambience and atmosphere in an institution, in a home, or any other space in which they might be displayed. And here we see an example of that, of a drawing by Michael Webb on the left-hand side as a kind of ambience and atmosphere of the drawing itself, and then a visitor enjoying the atmosphere of drawing on display at the Architectural Association in 1987. This exhibition brings together the works from the collection of Alvin Boyarsky, who was the chairman of the Architectural Association School of Architecture between 1971 and 1990, at a time when the school involved itself in the unprecedented level of the production of drawings, both by means of education through the different studios, but also through exhibitions, publications, and other types of international dissemination, in many ways becoming one of the last big schools of hand drawing before a digital shift or a digital turn of the early 1990s. The exhibition itself tries to present the idea of the ambience and the drawings in that kind of a dual way, both allowing you to appreciate the individual works on paper and their reproductions in catalogs, as well as to give you an idea of the ambience of the Architectural Association in which these drawings were initially exhibited and debated. And we are very grateful to Nicola Murphy and Nicola Boyarsky for their amazing and beautiful design of the show, which really builds on the qualities of individual pieces themselves to create a particular experience for you as an exhibition visitor. The show is divided into four different sections. The first one being the so-called European Radicals, a series of projects by architects that were part of groups such as the Super Studio, called Himmelblau, and Archigram that proposed alternatives to the then modern architecture, mostly playing on nomadic lifestyle, new technologies, and popular culture, including this imaginary vision of a New York City skyline wrapped by a continuous structure through the work of Super Studio. The second section is about the reflections on modernity, looking back on the idea of modernity and trying to bring it to a contemporary level at that time in 1970s and 80s, looking at the work of contemporary architects such as Bernard Tschumi, Zaha Hadid, and Office for Metropolitan Architecture, or OMA, where they looked in particular at the work of Russian constructivists and artists and architects such as Kazimir Malevich and others who worked with abstract form to propose these new sort of imaginary societies or abstract ideas in arts themselves. So what is interesting for this group of architects is not that that project of modernism has failed or that these buildings proposed by the constructivists were not built, but it's precisely that it was unfinished. It was precisely this idea that this project is unfinished and it could be completed today is what intrigued these architects. And they tried to propose that idea of taking it to the next level and bringing it to our own contemporary culture. And in the process, they developed a completely new language, which came to be known as Deconstructivist architecture in the late 1980s. Like many other institutions of its era, Architectural Association had a keen interest in history, but it was also very different and very unique. Unlike many other places that were really involved in a very historicist architecture of the 1980s, reviving neoclassical styles or neoclassical architectural language, the Architectural Association under Alvin Boyarsky pursued a different trajectory where the exploration of history was more about timeless questions of memory, historical trauma, war, memorials, rather than a particular stylistic language. Here are just a couple of examples of those kinds of work by John Hayduk on the left and Russian paper architects who try to propose an alternative to like a Soviet planned architecture and planned economy through these beautiful etchings and prints that echo a kind of a historical quality of architecture and the kind of memory embedded either in architectural forms such as buildings or in different kinds of figures. And then emanating from these reflections on both history and modernity and the European radicals is a very important section of the exhibition, which is called Drawing Practice, which really talks about how at the AA in the 1970s, the idea of drawing really exploded, and it was expanded to include printmaking, technical drawing, and freehand drawing, as exemplified here in these three very different drawings produced by a single architect, Peter Wilson, who was really looking for the visual language. The exhibitions at the AA between 1970s, 71 and 1990 did not include only the work of the AA students and faculty, but also the visiting artists and architects, including Shin Takamatsu on the left-hand side and Mary Mies on the right-hand side, who in this case experimented with really beautiful technical drawings, either in ink or pencil, trying to really develop a visual language that's very unique to the way how ultimately they would like to build these pieces. And that is sort of evident later on in the link between Mary Mies' drawings, for example, and how she built some of these pieces, or similarly in the work of Shin Takamatsu. So how was this sort of explosion of drawing related to Alvin Boyarsky's own intellectual background? And I would argue this is not coincidental. He himself touched on the relationship to history, modernity, and drawing practice, even in his own work. And this is an interesting image that shows his office in 1983, relatively empty walls, and then the same office in 1990, soon after his passing, filled with different kinds of drawings by Shumi, Hadid, Russian paper architects, and so on, showing that the production of drawings was somewhat a key aspect of his pedagogical and curatorial agenda at the Architectural Association. It is perhaps not as well known that he had an intersection with Colin Rowe, one of the main protagonists of a kind of a historicist view on architecture in the 1970s and 1980s, who wrote a very influential essay and book, Collage City. He prompted Boyarsky to write a dissertation as a graduate student in planning at Cornell University in the late 1950s, focused on Camillo Zitte, a very peculiar Viennese architect at the turn of the century who resisted modernization of cities and instead promoted historical forms. For that was Boyarsky's link and maybe touch with kind of a historical memory of that particular time and context. He also had a very interesting reflection on modernism and modernity in his own work. In the 1960s, he was the associate dean at the newly founded University of Illinois at Chicago, which was a time of very violent, very strong political protest, the 1968 student demonstrations, the 1970s demonstrations against American involvement in the Vietnam War. And as associate dean, he managed to work with students to create a hub of political protest within the School of Architecture building, in which the students really produced these different kinds of posters and events to really express their own political activism, which again links to the larger idea of modernism and social progress. He also wrote a very interesting compendium or an essay on the history of the city of Chicago called Chicago a la carte, the city as an energy system, which is told by popular picture postcards that shows images of modernist progress through airports, highways, railroad stations, stockyards, as a way to provide an alternative history of modern architecture in Chicago that is different from, let's say, Chicago School of Architecture or Mies van der Rohe and so on. And he also had a very interesting intersection with the European radicals, many of whom are represented in the exhibition, but also people like Hans Hollein, who offered lectures and events as a part of an enterprise that Boyarsky called the International Institute of Design, which he ran as a series of summer sessions between 1970 and 72, where students can choose from a menu of options to tackle a particular contemporary issues, be it an environmental issue, design issue. This was a time of a major environmental crisis and energy crisis in the 1970s. So a lot of the studios and events offered as a part of this summer school tackled those kinds of issues. But the important thing is that Unlike a fixed curriculum of a school, the summer sessions were more like a subway line, as Boyarsky described it, where students could hop on and off and enjoy and learn from different kinds of events and workshops, lectures, and so on. And this could not be more different than an idea of a modernist curricular diagram of a school, exemplified here by the Bauhaus diagram on the left, where students move through a series of courses as developed or charted by Walter Gropius, the founding director, or even as late as 1960s at the Bartlett School of Architecture in London under Richard Llewellyn Davis, where students were really studying in this kind of curricular way in between social science, material science, or engineering, so to speak, and planning, thinking of architecture as a kind of a science of design. And even at the AA in the 1960s, just before Boyarsky came, the then principal Michael Lloyd developed a curricular diagram on the left, which really revolves around the idea of different years that sort of increase in complexity, leading to a more of a kind of a planning scale project in the last year. Instead, when Boyarsky led the reform of the education at the AA, the school transformed into a system of really events, lectures, exhibitions, and the core pedagogical structure of the school was the so-called unit system, where students could choose from a menu of different options of optional studios and were placed in those studios based on a competitive portfolio review, where the development of a unique language was really critical. And on the right-hand side is this idea of the AA as shown in these 1970s diagrams as a series of bubbles of different topics dealing with contemporary issues. And this was also nurtured further by a series of exhibitions that Boyarsky organized. This is just a snapshot from one of the events list from 1981, showing the exhibitions by, for example, a Japanese-born architect, Kisa Kawakami, who was actually also one of the faculty members at the AA, or an artist called Eduardo Paolozzi, just showing you the breadth of different types of drawing approaches that the school really nurtured. All of these drawings also found their expression globally through different kinds of exhibition catalogs produced by the AA communications units. And the last two rows on the slide show the real impact of this concept of drawing practice that you see in the exhibition, which is that each teaching unit at the AA tried to develop their own unique visual language, both as a way to compete with each other or between each other for the students, but also as a way to chart a new approach for architecture, because this was a time in architecture, time of the critique of modernism, where with fever, architecture was looking for different kind of approaches, and diversity of approaches was really valued. Shown here are examples of drawings by students from a unit of faculty members or tutors, such as Dalibor Vesely and Mohsen Mostafavi, but also Christine Hawley and Peter Cook, Michael Gold, and so on. So in the exhibition itself, we try to really build on this idea of drawing practice. The drawing, as Boyarsky often said, was not sort of a means to an end, but it's also a form of practice of architecture in its own right. And we try to present a certain appreciation for the diversity of drawing. That in this particular institution at the AA, but maybe in this time in the 1970s and 80s, the architects really invested in trying to find their own way of drawing. And we also think this is really what is also interesting today when we live in the digital world, and maybe there's a certain flattening or equalization as to how architects draw. These different approaches can maybe teach us about how we in our own time can develop a certain experimental way and how we can use drawing to help us develop those kinds of experiment. What is also interesting in closing, just to say that this diversity of drawing approaches also match the diversity and the internationalism of the students and faculty at the AA. And in many ways, that's also what helped contribute to this kind of expansion of drawing practice as well. And we are particularly thrilled that this exhibition is coming to Taiwan, to a different kind of culture, different kind of linguistic and cultural context. And we're looking forward to a conversation with the audiences in Taiwan as to what these drawings meant back then in the 1970s and 80s, but also what do they mean today in our own context of 2021 as we emerge from the pandemic and as we try to also imagine and rethink what kind of role drawing can play in the next phase of architecture's evolution as a kind of a truly global discipline. Thank you very much.